Science is interesting, and if you don't agree, you can fuck off.
Welcome to the Darwin Digest, episode 46. This week we continue our study of all of the different humans. We're covering what's left of Africa this week. Previously we have discussed the groups that occupy the European world and Southern Africa, or South Africa. This week we are covering North, East and West Africa. I am joined as per usual by my co-hosts Kathy Princess.
Hello.
And Lawrence Drake.
Hello.
Alright, I guess we will jump into it right away then. So I'm covering North Africa. Just to start with, there's no real firm definition of the countries that occupy North Africa because different organizations call them different things, and some sources will refer to places like Egypt as Near Eastern, or anywhere across the north of Africa as Near Eastern rather than North African, and that's because of the genetic and cultural background of them, but it can get a bit confusing when they're sort of when you're jumping between sources, because it kind of sounds like the two are different regions. So I will be using Near East moderately interchangeably with North Africa because they're basically the same people. And also bits and pieces, this will come across as we were Kangsish. It's not my intention. What I'm trying to explain here is essentially why Tutankhamun, for instance, his genome is more similar to the average Nord than it is to the current Egyptian population. So, North Africa. It's the odd child of Africa because of the Saharan Desert, which provides a barrier to access. It prevents migration from the more southern areas, basically. It means that up until antiquity, and during most of antiquity, all of the trade and migration and all of the gene flow that comes from there came from Mediterranean sources rather than African sources. And even well before then, in prehistory, all of the gene flow and migration came from came from like Iberia and stuff like that, rather than Africa. In fact, in 2000, a study called Tracing European Founder Lineages in the Near Eastern Mitochondrial DNA Pool found that the sub-Saharan population contributed less than 1% to the total Near Eastern gene pool. This is also kind of seen through North Africa generally, so in North Africa, the population generally consists of two closely related but slightly different cultural groups. The first is the Ibero-Mauritian culture that lies along the uppermost part of North Africa and existed around 20,000 years ago. And the Caspian culture, which succeeded the Ibero-Mauritian around 10,000 years ago. We've got good evidence to indicate that the Caspian population was derived from the Ibero-Mauritian, but there's still a bit of debate there. But at this point, we can be fairly certain, like DNA tests and stuff like that. But there's always sort of give and take with these sort of things. Where it gets a bit Kangsy, a series of studies comparing various DNA lineages. One in particular found that Sami, which you may remember from a European episode that Kathy covered, which are like the Scandinavian, they're essentially like the more pure, original European, sort of like the base European is the best way to describe it. And Berber mitochondrial DNA actually showed that they share a fair bit of recent ancestry. From a paper called Sami and Berber, an unexpected mitochondrial DNA link by Alessandro Achilli et al. Quick description of why mitochondrial DNA, just before I read from it, of why mitochondrial DNA keeps coming up. And it's because it's the most stable of your genome, with the exception of the Y chromosome. Because it doesn't undergo crossing over, neither does the Y chromosome. What that means is the chromatids don't sort of get mixed up, is the simplest way to phrase it. And so, because of that, the lineage remains pure. You know, that particular chromatid has descended from, you know, their mother to them, because mitochondrial DNA is only passed down from the mother. So a mother will give it to the son and give it to her daughter, and the daughter can give it to her sons and her daughters. So it's always passed down from the mother. So you know that you can follow the lineage of mitochondrial DNA through the mother's line, which is why it's so useful as a measuring tool, because it's consistent and, like I said, doesn't cross over, so you don't have to worry about things getting mixed up. Anyway, from the paper, such a recent common ancestry of maternal lineages found in populations living as far as 9,000 miles apart and whose anthropological affinities are not at all obvious is, to say the least, unexpected. Can we provide a reasonable explanation? The recent molecular dissection of other mtDNA haplogroups reveals some clues. H1 and H3, two frequent subhaplogroups of H, display frequency peaks centered in Iberia and surrounding populations, including the Berbers of Morocco and coalescence ages of around 11,000 years ago. Tequili et al., 2004. Furthermore, their frequency patterns and ages resemble those reported for haplogroup V, Taroni et al., 2001, which, similar to U5B1b, is extremely common only in the Sami, together with U5B1b, and V encompasses almost 90% of the Sami mtDNAs. Taroni et al., 2004 again, Tambets et al., 2004. Thus, although these previous studies have highlighted the role of the Franco-Cantabrian refugee area as a major source of the hunter-gatherer populations that gradually repopulated much of Central and Northern Europe when climatic conditions began to improve around 15,000 years ago, the identification of U5B1b now unequivocally links the maternal gene pool of the ancestral Berbers to the same refuge era, and indicates that European hunter-gatherers also moved towards the south, and by crossing the Strait of Gibraltar, contributed their U5B1b, H1, H3, and V mtDNAs to modern North Africans. So what does all that mean? Essentially, when the last glacial maximum ended, last glacial maximum was 24,000 years ago. When the maximum ended and the glaciation commenced in the northern hemisphere, which was around 18 to 17,000 years ago, the populations that were stuck in the Franco-Cantabrian refuge area, which is an area that stretches from essentially the north of Spain to the north of the Iberian Peninsula more generally, to the south of France, and just sort of draw like a sort of a rough arc around, from the coasts of both of those meeting up. And that's kind of where there was extremely densely population was found extremely dense there, because essentially there was one of the only places to live at that point in time, because going too far any direction around there was just too cold to live. When the glaciers melted, they were able to migrate to places that now they could move through those glaciers, and they could migrate to other places, including other ones that had people there. And so those populations that were stuck in the Franco-Cantabrian refuge area were suddenly able to spread through Europe and into the Near East. It's from this combined stock that the modern Berbers are derived, modern being 6,000 years ago. And that's kind of where when the Capsian people come from, is that combination of those two groups. And when the seafaring peoples came into ascendancy, the Phoenicians, the Greeks, and then later the Romans, they formed trading posts and colonies all along the southern Mediterranean shore, so North Africa. The Phoenicians would eventually go to create a colony that would become, the great enemy, the arch nemesis, if you would, of the Greek and Roman peoples. That's the city-state of Carthage. The Greeks would go to form a couple of different dynasties in Egypt and interbred, and everyone's heard about Cleopatra, who maintained that kingdom and maintained Egypt until the Romans took over. I think it was like 30 BC, something like that. And yeah, so this at that point in time, the population was not Arabidized like it is now. It was actually not European per se, but there was uh, lots of interbreeding in there. And there was kind of like it's like a happy medium, I guess, between peoples who were heavily Europeanized and European colonists who were coming in and traders who were coming in. Do you guys have any thoughts on that?
So I just kind of I was kind of wondering. So where does the whole Nubian thing fall into that? Because for a while, I know Egypt was kind of overrun by the kings, and how much of an impact did their sort of genetics leave into the population?
Very little. Like I said, modern studies show that the that those ethnic that essentially groups that have managed to stay ethnically homogenous as Berbers and whatever have less than 1% sub-Saharan African genetic lineage. So very, very minor. Unfortunately, they were not in fact Kangs. This is out of my area of expertise, but there's archaeological evidence that basically stones that are inscribed with essentially no Nubians beyond this point along the Nile, where they were not allowed to travel any further north than that. They were
That's
quite
racist.
That's racist, yeah. Unfortunately, yeah, unfortunately for all of the black Egyptians, they were not in fact Kangs. Except for the two of the pharaohs. I didn't really look too much into them because that wasn't the particular area Egypt wasn't the particular area that was interesting me. It was more sort of, it was actually surprisingly difficult to even just track down that sort of bit of information that I had, just because everything's obfuscated by haplogroups, so it kind of is it's not like deliberately there to hide the truth or anything like that. It's just there's a layer of obfuscation there that's just a purely technical thing that makes it a little bit awkward to sort of troll through. So I sort of focused on that part. But yeah, so that essentially explains why we have all of this, or goes a long way to explaining why there is all of this European admixture in those groups, and why we consider that bloody hell, what's his name? Al-Assad is, he wouldn't be a European, but he's pretty damn close. And because of those particular population groups were actually heavily interbred with Europeans. And, it's, like I say, it's not, doesn't make them European, but definitely makes it a hell of a lot easier to get along with than, say, bloody hell, what's his name? President of Zimbabwe.
Mugabe.
Mugabe, yeah.
Yeah.
It's, one of these I would actually prefer to have diplomatic relationships with, and the other not so much.
Yeah. Well, I mean, that part of the world really kept getting fresh influxes of, white DNA, from the sort of original stock, and then there were the Greeks, and then there were the Romans, etc., etc. So, yeah, it's not surprising that you can get some really sort of white presenting individuals over there still, but yeah.
Even in Carthage, which was a Phoenician colony, which Semites, basically Canaanites, or the bad ones, as they were, they had quite heavy levels of, at least indications of heavy levels of gene flow. There is at least one genotyped corpse from a Carthaginian tomb that I found that was basically genetically identical with the Basque.
Yeah.
In Spain. And
yeah, that's really it's really interesting how because the Basques, again, there's some I think, a population that would be interesting for us to cover. But it's interesting how you can find these kind of parallels between the different different tribes of European origin. Yeah, sorry, carry on.
No. Yeah, you're right. It is really interesting. And just to be clear, that one body doesn't mean that the Carthaginians were, they were white. We have very strong evidence. We basically know for a fact that they were Semites, but they were a melting pot. They actually, I had a little bit written about this. I might as well go into it right now. So just a quick disclaimer: this is not my area of expertise. I'll try and keep it brief. And apologies if the details are a little bit vague or wrong, or even a bit wrong. But Carthage has some really interesting analogues to a certain other group of modern Semites that I thought was too interesting to pass off. Like I said, the founding stock of Carthage is undeniably Semitic, from the Phoenicians, the Canaanites. They quickly became a ruling polarity, or even possibly a minority. We don't have exact numbers, obviously. There was a period of time where they were paying tribute to the Berbers around them, but that didn't last for very long. They very quickly became a economic power, basically on the basis of foreign trade. They were a trading hub, and they dealt with the native Berbers by intermarriage and diplomacy, essentially. Like I said, there's a body in the tomb that's Iberian from its genotype. There are a few others that sort of indicate various other things. So it's very much like the typical, stereotypical happy liberal place where it's all a melting pot of everyone, all these different genetic populations, ethnic and cultural populations, all sort of coming together all happily. That is ruled over by a ethnically homogenous ruling class. Funny that. Carthaginian power was derived from its mercantile prowess rather than its military. Its military strength came from hired mercenaries. They were also famous for their, at least according to the Greeks and Roman sources, famous as needlessly cruel and barbaric. Now, obviously, that might be affected by the continuous conflict between them. Like I said, they were kind of the arch nemesis of the Greeks and the Romans. They were the final bad guy sort of thing. But there are some strong indications that this was in fact at least true to a degree. Everyone knows about the child sacrifice thing, which, as far as we know, is true and definitely the balance of probabilities is more likely than not. And there are people in our movement who can go into a whole heap more detail on that than I can. So I'll just skip over it. But there's also little things like at one point the Carthaginians imposed a levy of 50% of Berber crops in the surrounding areas. So if you were a Berber farmer, you had to give up half of the bushels of whatever crop that you were farming, whereas the Carthaginian farmers didn't have to do that. And obviously, it's just sort of like it's almost like cartoonishly evil, which I thought was kind of amusing.
That's still kind of like the tax rate in Western Europe at the moment, so.
Yeah, well, we hear from the libertarians how low the tax rate is historically, and that's a 50% tax rate.
Yeah, that's like
just thinking of that there.
People in Denmark would like that, would consider that a tax cut.
But, yeah. If you're in the highest bracket in Australia, that's pretty cheap as well. But yeah, it's kind of impressive for a couple of thousand years ago. But yeah, I just thought the analogues between, and it makes sense because they're genetic links, but just the analogues between the Carthaginians and other Semites is just a very interesting one to make. Anyway, that's pretty much my bit.
Yeah, I think I just want to comment on the Carthaginians a little bit because I remember listening, that basic bitch history, hardcore history podcast by that guy.
Yeah. Yep.
And he was pretty convinced that they did burn their children to sacrifice the children to Moloch or whatever. And I know there's people who are kind of more expert on this subject, but just the idea of it, it's like, no wonder the Romans salted the earth, so that nothing would grow there. It's like, it's a kind of cruelty that's that people have attributed to the Jews as well, with like blood libel and stuff, and it seems to be that it's like a Semitic type of a cruelty, if you know what I mean. It's kind of a trait that's very there seems to be, what if it is true, that it's just their trait kind of thing.
Yeah, I do think it's more likely true than not. I'm not an expert in the area, so I don't want to make definitive statements. That's why I am hesitant to say definitively one way or the other on a show that's meant to be about accuracy, when it's something that I am not an expert. Not even though I'm not an expert on, that I am not properly informed about. That's why I'm hesitant. I'm fairly certain that it is true, though, just from even just archaeological evidence, the child necropolises and all of that sort of stuff. There is somebody who I'm hoping he will be doing more stuff in the future. I don't want to say his name because issues, but he told me a while back about an anecdote regarding child sacrifice in Jews. Essentially, at one point, their religious law forbade them from sacrificing their own children. And so, Judaism's all about outdoing God. They got the smart idea that if you want to sacrifice your child to Moloch or whoever, and you find someone else that wants to sacrifice their child, then why don't you just swap children? You're not sacrificing your child. It's all perfectly legal.
Yeah. It's
Like,
kind of
that's
Talmudic legalism that is plaguing our society today, and in many different aspects. But yeah,
it's just it's kind of impressive. Like, when you think about it, it's like, so it's just morbidly just like, wow.
Yeah, I really can't think of at least sort of in the global north, a different tribe that regularly sacrifice children. I mean, obviously you can find examples of, like, in times of great famine or great war, a great sacrifice to the gods needs to be made, etc., etc. And then again, it usually was like a grown, an older.
It was adult. There is plenty of evidence to suggest adults were sacrificed.
Yeah.
What's interesting is sort of the lack of the ritual descriptions that we have, especially in, say, Scandinavian culture. We don't actually have a good description or any description of human sacrifice, although we knew it did happen. Actually, just as another, just as an aside, something I found really amusing. I'm a big fan of Norse mythology. I do a lot of reading in my own time. In one of the sagas, and this is the best description of a sacrifice that we have, of a human sacrifice that we have. It is a sacrifice particularly to Odin. Going a bit culture camp here for a minute, but like I think it's really funny. Essentially, I actually mentioned this on the Culture Camp episode on the poet Prose Ada, so you should check that out as well. But essentially, the hero in this saga and his raiding party, had his king along for the ride, got stranded on an island. They couldn't sail off because the winds wouldn't pick up, and eventually they decided that they had to make a sacrifice to get off the island. They drew lots to see who would be sacrificed, and the king came up. Every time the king kept coming up, so they didn't want to sacrifice the king, but every time they redrew the lots, the king came up. Eventually, the hero went to bed, got a message from Odin basically saying, "I am going to get this man, and you're going to bring him to me." So he told the king that we'll do a sacrifice in spirit, in essence, not actually kill you. So we'll put a rope around your neck and tie it to a low branch of a tree, one that's not high enough to hang you. And instead of a spear, I'll throw a stick at you or a twig at you. And so he goes to do it, do this thing, and put the ropes put around the king's neck, and he throws the twig. The twig turns into a full spear, hits him in the chest, and the tree springs up into the air, pulling the rope tight and breaking his neck. And it's just that's the closest that we have to an example of human sacrifice, and obviously that's mythic. Like, it's not real, but the idea of hanging someone and throwing a spear may very well have been a way of human sacrifice in the in like the Old Norse times. But we don't really have any other better ideas of sacrifice other than like the peat bogs, where we have evidence that some people had their throats cut ritualistically and then were thrown into the bog.
Yeah,
but even that lacks details.
Yeah.
When it comes to the Canaanites, we have like fairly graphic descriptions of exactly what they would do to the children.
Yeah,
how they were put into the burning hands and stuff. Sorry, how they were put into the burning hands and stuff like that. Yeah.
Jeez, I mean, yeah, it's I mean, the other aspect into kind of Norse and in general, Northern European, human sacrifice was usually the slave that got killed when the king died to keep him company. But again, that was like it seemed to be. It seems that sort of even from there was no needless cruelty to it, if you know what I mean. It's just
they just killed them and they were done with it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Whereas, like,
you don't put a live baby in what's essentially a giant frying pan.
Yeah, it seems to be like that level of disregard for human life. I mean, it boggles the mind, how they could do it. But I guess you can't judge different cultures, Goy.
Yeah, you have to be you have to be tolerant of burning babies alive. I'm probably going to get some like comments about Pizzagate and all that sort of stuff. I don't know. With that, like, who knows?
It's out of the remit of this podcast.
Yeah, we deal with the not even the past. We deal with things that can be easily measured. Let's leave it that way. Lawrence, did you have any thoughts? Sans Pizzagate.
I don't really know much about it.
Fair enough.
Oh,
right,
about
we'll
Pizzagate? No, I don't know anything about Pizzagate.
No, Sans Pizzagate. Sans Pizzagate is without Pizzagate. All of the stuff except for Pizzagate. I don't want to... It's a really interesting topic, but I don't think this is the podcast for it, so...
No, I don't really have any comment.
All right, fair enough. All right, I guess we will move on to East Africa next, and that was you, Lawrence, wasn't it?
Yeah.
All right, East Africa.
Okay. Well, this is going to be a fairly broad overview because getting into every little detail would take an enormous amount of time. So I'll just give a sort of general overview of different regions and got a story to finish things off. East Africa would be considered the regions that compose the modern-day Tanzania, Kenya, Uganda, Burundi, South Sudan, also Eritrea, Ethiopia, and Somalia. And there's about 160 different ethnic groups in East Africa, and of course I'm not going to name every one of them, but some of the largest are the Oromo in southern Ethiopia, the Somali, the Afar in Eritrea, the Djibouti, the Tigray and Tigray who speak Semitic languages, Nilo-Saharan speakers that include the Lu, Lango, Kalenjin, Maasai, Karamojong, and of course you got some Bantus. Bantu speaking groups are the Kikuyu, Chaga, and Kamba. And some famous East Africans would be Ayaan Hirsi Ali, who was born in Somalia, which is a former Dutch politician and critic of Islam. And East Africans dominate marathon, like endurance sports. West Africans dominate the sprint, East Africans the endurance events. Europe wasn't very interested in sub-Saharan Africa before the 19th century. There wasn't extensive Roman exploration or colonization of that region, mainly because of the Saharan desert's difficult to cross, and they probably didn't really see much of a reason for doing it. Later on, the colonial powers believed that there was gold in Africa, so that incited their interest. And they're right, there is a lot of gold and anything else you could possibly want in Africa. There is a 1st century account of the East African coast, which was written by a Greek merchant living in Egypt called the Periplus Maris Erythrae, and there's also Ptolemy's Guide to Geography, which was based on Byzantine geographical knowledge circa 400 AD. So there's no written records dating before the last century because they had no written languages before they were introduced by the Arabs. Actually, that's not entirely true, and I'll get into that a bit later. But going back to the beginning, it's thought that East Africa was the origin of the Homo sapiens species. About 50,000 BC, you find evidence of hand axes being produced in the areas that are now Kenya and Tanzania. And 10,000 years ago, you have stone tools and the use of fire being evident. Hunter-gatherer communities are being formed at this time, and some of the descendants are still around, such as the Twa and Mabuti in western Uganda, and the Sandawa, who are related genetically and linguistically to the San in South Africa. Agriculture and animal domestication in East Africa started about 2,000 years ago, so it was actually a latecomer to the game of agriculture and animal domestication compared to the Middle East, Europe and Asia. And that started in Kenya and northern Tanzania, probably introduced by Kushites from Ethiopia. And there's a major Iron Age site in the Rift Valley in northern I don't know if it's Tanzania or Tanzania. I think I've said both of those, so I might just use them interchangeably. Northern Tanzania, which also practiced agriculture and irrigation. It seems likely that this region was inhabited by Cushitic speakers. And this population was probably responsible for spreading ironworking and the cultivation of bananas to the rest of East Africa. The Interlacrustine region is the region bounded by the lakes Victoria, Kyogam, Albert Edward and Tanganyika, and dating about 1,000 years ago there are vague accounts of rulerships who may have been judicial arbitrators or ritual leaders rather than political figures. So I'm kind of getting into the search for Kangs, which I'll talk a bit about. Later on, in the midpoint of the 2nd millennium, the area is thought to be dominated by the Chewezi dynasty. And the Chewezi are associated with earthwork sites at Bigo, Mubendi, Mansa, Kibengo and Bugoma. And I can't guarantee I'm pronouncing these things correctly, but there you go, which are located in western Uganda. And the largest of these sites is in Bigo, which has a ditch system. And it's about 10 kilometres long, and it's cut from rock, and it encloses a grazing area for livestock. So this suggests some sort of political power which was able to mobilise that sort of labour. And radiocarbon dating in the area shows that it was occupied from the mid-14th to the early 16th century, after which the Chewezi were supplanted by the Luo, rulers of the Bito clan. So there's a general overview of the broadly East Africa. I'll go into some specific areas. Ethiopia, which I think is a kind of interesting area historically in terms of East Africa. It's a site where anatomically modern humans may have emerged, and the first civilization in Ethiopia was the Damat, which existed between the 10th and 5th centuries BC. Now, not much is known about it, but they did have a written script. So, I said before they didn't have written languages. There is one, but it wasn't very extensive. It was only used in one localized area, and it's called the Ge'ez. I'm not sure how you pronounce it. I think it's actually pronounced G's. And it is a Semitic language, and there was dispute among historians as to whether the Damat derive from the Sabians, who were a population located in what's now Yemen, and it's now considered indigenous to the region, but with Sabian influence. So after the Damat, there was the Kingdom of Ascom from 100 to 940 AD, which facilitated trade between the Roman Empire and India, and that it minted its own currency. So there's a bit of archaeological evidence from there. Kenya is an area heavily populated by hunter-gatherers, or was in the Neolithic, and they were replaced by the Kushtiks from the Horn of Africa, and then you had a Bantu migration in the first millennium AD. And it's the site of Swahili culture, which existed along the coast. In the first century, you have city-states such as Mombasa, Malindi, and Zanzibar, and they traded with the Arabs and Persians. And the Wikipedia page says, quote, "Many historians have long believed that the city-states were established by Arab or Persian traders, but scholars now recognise that the city-states were an indigenous development where the apex of their development was around the 8th century CE. But the source for that turned out to be a YouTube video, so maybe it's best to take that with a pinch of salt. I always thought they were established by Arabs, but yeah, I guess it's an area of ongoing investigation. These city-states eventually did become Muslim, though, and the Kilwa Sultanate in the medieval era was centred in Tanzania and stretched along the Swahili coast. And the Swahili coast was conquered by the Omani Arabs from what's modern-day Oman. And the slave trade expanded to meet the demands of Oman and Zanzibar. Now, Zanzibar is an island. I like that word, don't you? Zanzibar. That's a good word. Zanzibar is an island off the coast of Tanzania, and it was a major slave trading civilization, first populated by Bantu, then conquered by Arabs, then the Portuguese, then it was a British protectorate, and the British actually put pressure on the Sultan to end slavery. Tanzania was originally populated by the Hadza and Sindawi hunter-gatherers, and they actually speak with that click language. And two waves of migration, 4,000 and 2,000 years ago, populated the region with Kushtiks from southern Ethiopia. Now, during these times, there was a migration wave from Mashariki, they're a Bantu tribe from West Africa, and these Bantus brought iron making and agriculture, and they were mainly growing yams. The Maasai migrated, and they're a pretty well-known tribe, a fairly large one, migrated between 1,500 and 500 years ago. And similar to Zanzibar, it was conquered by Omani Arabs, and then the Portuguese, and then the Omani Sultan kicked them out, and then they became a British protectorate. Another major region in East Africa is Madagascar. Now, Madagascar is an island off the coast of Southeast Africa, and it's a really fascinating place. Earliest settlement dates around 2000 BC, and later migrations between 350 BC and 550 AD occurred via canoe from southern Borneo. Now, the thing that makes Madagascar interesting is just the rich abundance of flora and fauna that are found there and that used to be there. It used to have things such as the giant lemur, and I don't know if you're familiar with lemurs, but they're small, like monkey creatures, and they used to have ones that were as big as gorillas. So that's the giant lemur. Also the elephant bird, which, get this, imagine an ostrich, and then imagine it twice the size of a human. Yeah, they totally existed there. And I'm not talking about a prehistoric animal, I'm talking about something that was pretty recent. It was hunted to extinction by about 600 AD. And Arab traders established outposts between the 7th and 9th century. There's a major shipping route. And yeah, between the 7th and 9th century, there was a lot of Arab outposts, and Bantu migrants from Southeast Africa arrived in 1000 AD, and European contact occurred in the 1500s. First the Portuguese, then the French established trading colonies in the late 17th century, and the current population are the Malagasy, who are sort of mixture of Southeast Asiatics and Bantu. Okay, I've just got a story to tell now. So is there any commentary on what I've just talked about?
I had a question. I don't know if I missed it when you said, but where did the Bantu migration originate, and kind of why did they? Why was there this huge migration of them?
Well, the Bantu were one of the first to develop agriculture, and when they developed agriculture, that gave them a big boost to their population. And once they started getting a big population, they wanted to move out, and they started dominating other tribes.
Okay, and are they like? Did they originate in Kenya or
The
somewhere
Bantu.
thereabouts?
I don't
Yeah.
think the Bantu originate in Kenya. I think they're West Africans.
Oh, okay, that makes sense. Okay, sorry, I just have no idea about this. So
Yeah, there
I was
were
wondering.
waves from west to east, and the Bantu
Oh,
did have
okay.
this massive advantage from agriculture.
Okay, makes sense.
Yeah. Okay, so do you want me to tell the story now?
Yeah, go for it, man.
Okay, so this is from a book. I originally wrote like a summary of it, but I thought I might as well just read it from the book because it doesn't go for very long. And it's from the book The 48 Laws of Power by Robert Greene. And it's an interesting book. It's got lots of historical anecdotes in it, so if you're a history lover, you might find it interesting. So I'll just take it from the top. In the mid-1920s, the powerful warlords of Ethiopia were coming to the realization that a young man of the nobility named Haile Selassie, also known as Rastafari, was outcompeting them all and nearing the point where he could proclaim himself their leader, unifying the country for the first time in decades. Have you guys heard of Haile Selassie?
I have, yes.
Yeah, he's a pretty interesting person. Do this. Google his name, Selassie, and do a Google image search for it. He's Ethiopian, but he doesn't look like a Negroid. If you look at a picture of him, he looks more like an Arab. I mean, he doesn't.
Yeah,
He doesn't.
looks like he's got significant Arab admixture or Semitic admixture.
Yes, yeah. I mean, he doesn't look white to me, but he certainly doesn't look like what you would normally associate an African with. And as I mentioned, he is otherwise known as Rastafari, and the Rastafarians actually worship this guy as a god. So there you go. That's what happens when you smoke a lot of drugs and invent a religion. But he is, in his own right, a fascinating historical character. So, just picking up, most of his rivals could not understand how this wispy, quiet, mild-mannered man had been able to take control. Yet in 1927, Selassie was able to summon the warlords, one at a time, to come to Addis Ababa and declare their loyalty and recognise him as leader. Some hurried, some hesitated, but only one, Djazmach Balacha of Sidamo, dared defy Selassie totally. A blustery man, Boucher was a great warrior, and he considered the new leader weak and unworthy. He pointedly stayed away from the capital. Finally, Selassie, in his gentle but stern way, commanded Boucher to come. The warlord decided to obey, but in doing so, he would turn the tables on this pretender to the Ethiopian throne. He would come to Addis Ababa, and at his own speed, and with an army of 10,000 men, a force large enough to defend himself, perhaps even start a civil war. Stationing this formidable force in a valley 3 miles from the capital, he waited, as a king would. Selassie would have to come to him. Selassie did indeed send emissaries, asking Boucher to attend an afternoon banquet in his honour. But Boucher, no fool, knew history. He knew that previous kings and lords of Ethiopia had used banquets as a trap. Once he was there and full of drink, Selassie would have him arrested or murdered. To signal his understanding of the situation, he agreed to come to the banquet, but only if he could bring his personal bodyguard, 600 of his best soldiers, all armed and ready to defend him and themselves. To Boucher's surprise, Selassie answered with the utmost politeness that he would be honoured to play host to such warriors. On the way to the banquet, Boucher warned his soldiers not to get drunk and to be on their guard. When they arrived at the palace, Selassie was his charming best. He deferred to Boucher, treating him as if he desperately needed his approval and cooperation. But Boucher refused to be charmed, and he warned Selassie that if he did not return to his camp by nightfall, his army had orders to attack the capital. Selassie reacted as if hurt by his mistrust. Over the meal, when it came time for the traditional singing of songs in honour of Ethiopia's leaders, he made a point of allowing only songs honouring the warlord Sidamo. It seemed to Boucher that Selassie was scared, intimidated by this great warrior who could not be outwitted. Sensing the change, Boucher believed that he would be the one to call the shots in the days to come. At the end of the afternoon, Boucher and his soldiers began their march back to the camp, amidst cheers and gun salutes. Looking back to the capital over his shoulder, he planned his strategy, how his own soldiers would march through the capital in triumph within weeks, and Selassie would be put in his place being either prison or death. When Boucher came in sight of his camp, however, he saw that something was terribly wrong. Where before there had been colourful tents stretching as far as the eye could see, now there was nothing, only smoke from doused fires. What devil's magic was this? A witness told Boucher what had happened. During the banquet, a large army, commanded by an ally of Selassie's, had stolen up on Boucher's encampment by a side route he had not seen. This army had not come to fight, however. Knowing that Boucher would have heard a noisy battle and hurried back with his 600-man bodyguard, Selassie had armed his own troops with baskets of gold and cash. They had surrounded Boucher's army and proceeded to purchase every last one of their weapons. Those who refused were easily intimidated. Within a few hours, Boucher's entire force had been disarmed and scattered in all directions. Realizing his danger, Boucher decided to march south with his 600 soldiers to regroup, but the same army that had disarmed his soldiers blocked his way. The other way out was to march on the capital, but Selassie had set a large army to defend it. Like a chess player, he had predicted Boucher's moves and had checkmated him. For the first time in his life, Boucher surrendered. To repent his sins of pride and ambition, he agreed to enter a monastery. That's the tale of Selassie.
Can you imagine doing that to any European army, think famous European army? Maybe not nowadays with all the diversity, but can you imagine doing that to the Wehrmacht? Can you imagine doing that to Napoleon's legions? Just, I'll give you some money for your gun. That would not work.
It's a strategy that French troops use. There was a guy in Africa, I forget which country, but the French actually overthrew him just by showing up to his palace with crates of money and handing it out to the guards, and the guards just left. Then they walked in, took over the country.
Yeah, well, think about it, the amount of resources that you would expend fighting. If you spend, even 99% of that, it's still cheaper.
It often is cheaper to buy off enemies or pay someone else to fight. It's a strategy that the Byzantines extensively used. The Byzantines, after the Roman Empire collapsed, the Byzantines had another 500-year stretch, and basically how they remained in power is, only use your own troops as a last resort, and they made extensive use of diplomacy, allies, getting other people to fight for them, paying people to fight, paying people to not fight them. All valid strategies that go back as far as civilization has existed.
Yeah, well, the Varangian Guard, Vikings who, bodyguard for the Byzantine emperors. They were first hired after Byzantine. It wasn't their army. I think it was a mercenary force. Like lost a battle against a group of Northman raiders, and so you know what? I'm going to hire these guys.
Yeah, that's a strategy that the British also used. Conquer a country, and whoever put up the best fight, hire them. Yeah, you're good fighters. Work for us. Like the Gurkhas in Afghanistan, or I should say Nepal. Yeah.
Yeah, I was going to say Nepal. The best part about about just paying off the blacks though is because their time preference is so high. Like you don't have to pay them that much.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's a really amusing story. Just it just basically the stereotypical outwitting, the smart man beating the brute sort of thing. It's a fun story. It just sort of actually does a really good job of sort of illustrating the traditional dynamic of Africa.
Well, Selassie certainly was a smart guy, and he even put up a pretty good fight against Mussolini when the Italians invaded. He eventually got beaten, but not without a good fight.
Yeah. But then, the Italians went on to basically build all of the infrastructure in Ethiopia, so they can't really be complaining that much.
Well, they did get...
What was it?
Yeah.
What was it that... I can't remember where I heard it. It might have even been on one of the previous, more recent Darwin Digest. There hasn't been a single road built in Ethiopia since the Italians moved out.
Yeah.
Something like that. Or a single sealed road built. That's... That's 60 years now.
Yeah.
Close to 70 years now.
Yeah, well,
that's a long time.
Yeah, well, it doesn't have an extensive history of colonialism compared to other places, and it's something that Jared Taylor has talked about, that the places that have been colonised more tend to do better than the places that are colonised least in Africa.
Yeah. Well, and from the stuff that I've read, actually Ethiopia is kind of the exception to that particular rule, more because they got... during the period of time that Italy was there, they got stuff done. Mussolini may have not made the trains run on time, but he definitely got roads into Ethiopia.
Yeah.
Anyway, Kathy, did you have any thoughts?
Well, we can see that the desire for Gibbs is genetic in the African.
It is strong in these ones.
It is strong in these ones, and also that, what was the point of building all that infrastructure? I mean, sure, it's we're speaking in hindsight now, but next time we recolonize Africa, let's not bother with any of that.
Well, from the perspective of the Italians, it was because they were planning on staying there.
Yeah, I understand. It's
a world war kind of got in the way. I'm not sure if you heard about it.
Yeah. Oh, that thing happened there, I guess.
Yeah. But no, I know what you mean though. You look at the Chinese now in Africa, and what's that documentary, Lawrence?
Empire of
Dust.
Yeah.
Yeah. Definitely fantastic. That one. The Chinese just go in there and just we'll build you a stadium or something relatively easy to build, compared to, railway networks and stuff like that, which are actually take a bit more planning and foresight than saying you could just basically copy paste a plan for. And all that sort of stuff. And we'll just build this for you, and then you give us all of your stuff. Sure. Whereas when the English and the Portuguese and the Italians, when they went there, they actually tried to give them actual useful infrastructure as opposed to some petty little bauble.
Yeah, but I think the problem with that is that I think that maybe the Chinese kind of, for one thing, they don't care, and for the other thing, they maybe understand the African psyche a bit better, because for them, I think in the context of marginal utility, a stadium where they can shoot some hoops or play some ball is much more useful than like infrastructure and civilization, if you know what I mean. They'd much rather have that, I think, and they can.
Well, yeah, they'd definitely much rather it, and it's kind of why you need to, if you do it, you kind of have to force civilization on them. That's, I 100% agree. It's just kind of sort of more pointing out the lack of empathy that the Chinese in particular possess towards every outgroup, whereas we have this desire, this altruistic desire that verges on the suicidal.
Yeah, I think we need to learn from the Chinese, really. They have this thing down a lot better. Like, you go in there, you take what you need, and don't give them anything, because they're not going to thank you for it. And I guess they had the benefit of learning from what happened to the original colonizers, the Europeans. Yeah.
The thing is, if you decide that, okay, we're going to make this population better, I wouldn't really, I don't think we have any obligation to, but I don't think it's, the steps that we could take are not beyond our means once we've, sorted out the suicidal part of our altruism.
Yeah, I don't think it's worth it though, because thinking about it, like, sure, if you embark on this 1,000-year long eugenic experiment in Africa, all you're gonna do is have a more formidable enemy at the end of it, because you're not gonna make them into us, because obviously why would you want to do that, and that's basically impossible. But all you can do is have a higher IQ Africa that's going to be a far more formidable enemy than these they are now. So I genuinely see no benefit.
Like, I actually don't, I don't really think that we should either, but just for the sake of argument and to defend, to continue the conversation, because hopefully by that point we're going out to the stars and they can go one way and we can go the other.
Yeah, but maybe. I mean,
I don't think it's
I don't
it's
think
something that we should be wasting resources
ninjas
on.
In space. That's all I'm saying.
I don't know. Gay niggers in space is pretty funny.
Oh yeah, that is a good one. No space
kangs.
No, we don't. I don't think we need.
They can finally get these pyramids working again.
Yeah, the pyramid spaceships. That's right.
Yes.
Shall I do my bit then? Speaking of kangs.
Speaking of kangs.
Okay.
Yes.
So
please enlighten us.
Please, I'll enlighten you all about the West Africans. So, in a way, West Africans may be kind of the most relevant to a lot of our listeners, because the majority of the American black population comes from that part of Africa, and that's the sort of people that they'll be the most used to. So, I got the general kind of introduction to this from Wikipedia, but the one thing that really struck me reading it was the kind of ridiculous tone that the article was written in, and I hope you guys pick it up from the bits that I read out. So the early human settlers, arrived in West Africa around 12,000 BC, which is, there's no citation to this. So farming began around the 5th millennium BC, as well as the domestication of cattle. But I read in Jared Diamond that in Africa there's no such thing as domestication, so I don't know.
Just a point that's about right.
Yeah.
They were somewhere between 5,000 and 7,000 years behind us agriculturally.
Yeah.
And so that makes sense.
I'm just making fun of Jared Diamond.
Oh no, Jared Diamond's an idiot. Yes. But no, I just thought because you said you weren't sure, so I just thought that is a number that I do know.
That makes sense.
So.
Okay. So, by about 1500 BC, ironworking technology allowed the sort of expansion of productivity, and the first city-states were formed. Northern tribes developed wall settlements and non-wall settlements that numbered at 400. Now, that's a very specific number. In the forest region, Iron Age cultures began to flourish, and an inter-region trade began to appear. The desertification of the Sahara and the climate change of the coast caused trade with the upper Mediterranean peoples to be seen. Now, I'm not sure who's writing this article, but it's you'll see as you go on that it's not it's a bit strange. So the domestication of the camel, which I'm sure was not done by Africans, allowed the development of a trans-Saharan trade with cultures across the Sahara. Trans-Saharan trade being across the Sahara by definition, including Carthage and the Berbers. Major exports included gold, cotton cloth, metal ornaments, and leather goods, which were then exchanged for salt, horses, textiles, and other materials. Local leather, cloth, and gold also contributed to the abundance of prosperity for many of the following empires. So they're going to talk about the Kangs now, the empires. So Mansa Musa was a big guy for you in the West African empires. So you look him up. He's one that the Kangs like to refer to. So the development of the region's economy allowed more centralized states and civilizations to form, beginning with the Nok culture that began around 1000 BC, and the Ghana Empire that first flourished between the 1st and 3rd centuries. And after that, there was the Mali Empire, and in current-day Mauritania, there's some archaeological sites in the towns of Tichit and Oualata that were initially constructed around 2000 BC and were found to have originated from the Soninke branch of the Mande peoples. Also, there's some archaeology of the city of Kumbi Saleh in modern-day Mauritania in the Mali Empire that came to dominate much of the region until its defeat by the Almoravids in 1052. So there was this big Arab historian slash ethnographer, Bilad al-Sudan, who went to Africa and basically had a bit of a look around, and he identified 3 great kingdoms, Ghana, Gao, and Kanem. Furthermore, there's no lack of these empires here. The Soso Empire fought to fill the void, but was defeated by the Mandinka forces of the Sundiata Keita, who was the founder of the new Mali Empire. The Mali Empire continued to flourish for several centuries, most particularly under Sundiata's grandnephew Musa I. That's the big guy for you, before a succession of weak rulers led to its collapse under Mossi, Tuareg, and Songhai invaders. In the 15th century, the Songhai would form a new dominant state based on Gao in the Songhai Empire under the leadership of Soni Ali and Askia Muhammad. So there's a lot of Arab or some type of Muslim influence in the region as well. So it's interesting because West Africa is one of the, I think, few places where Islam was there before Christianity was, because that was kind of only really brought into by sort of the modern European colonizers. So that's an interesting point. There's city-states is in sort of the Nigerian region arose in Igbo land, such as the 10th century kingdom of Nri, which helped birth the arts and customs of the Igbo people. Bono in the 12th century, which eventually culminated in the formation of the, and this is a Wikipedia article, the all-powerful Akan Empire of the Ashanti, while Ife rose to prominence around the 14th century. Further east, Owo arose as the dominant Yoruba state and the Aro Confederacy as a dominant Igbo state in modern-day Nigeria. The Kingdom of Nri was a West African medieval state in the present southeastern Nigeria and a subgroup of the Igbo people, whom I will talk about a little bit later on. The Kingdom of Nri was unusual in the history of the world government in that its leader exercised no military power over his subjects. Citation needed there, I think. The kingdom existed as a sphere of religious and political influence over a third of Igbo land and was administered by a priest-king called Eze Nri. The Eze Nri managed trade and diplomacy on behalf of the Nri people and possessed divine authority in religious matters, which were totally not underwritten by a big army, obviously. The Oyo Empire was a Yoruba empire of what is today western north-central Nigeria. Established in the 15th century, the Oyo Empire grew to become one of the largest West African states. It rose through the again, in Wikipedia, the outstanding organizational skills of the Yoruba. Wealth gained from the trade of its powerful cavalry. The Oyo Empire was the most politically important state in the region from the mid-17th to the late 18th century, holding sway not only over the most of the other kingdoms in Yorubaland, but also over nearby African states, notably the Fon Kingdom of Dahomey in the modern Republic of Benin. To the west, the Benin Empire was... Jesus, lots of empires there. I'm sure they were they weren't just like a couple of neighboring tribes stuck together. The Benin Empire was a pre-colonial empire located in what is now southern Nigeria. Its capital was Edo, now known as Benin City. It should not be confused with a modern-day country called Benin, formerly called Dahomey. So the Benin Empire was one of the, quote, oldest and most highly developed states in the coastal hinterland of West Africa, dating perhaps to the 11th century CE. The Benin Empire was governed by a sovereign emperor with hundreds of thousands of soldiers and a powerful council rich in resources, wealth, ancient science, and technology, with cities described as beautiful and large. Yeah. So...
Did they have flying pyramids?
I'm sure they did have fucking flying pyramids. I'm sorry, this is... who wrote this article? This is preposterous. Like, the outstanding organizational skills and the all-powerful empires. I mean...
Well, when you say, like, there was that one state that had... that did not need a military to function.
Yeah.
I think the actual explanation for that is something more along the lines of they couldn't get a military functioning.
Yeah, maybe. That's more like it, actually. Yeah, so that's the sort of overview of the kind of historical kingdoms of West Africa. I've got a couple of books that I think our listeners might find interesting, and they are available on archive.org, actually. So there is a book called Savage Africa, being from the narrative of a tour in equatorial, southwestern, northwestern Africa, with notes on the habits of the gorilla, on the existence of unicorns and tailed men, on the slave trade, on the origins, character, and capabilities of the Negro, and on the future civilization of Western Africa. This is by William Winwood Reade, in the sort of the 19th century. Now, he has one chapter that's specifically on what he described as the Negro, and I think because we're more anthropologically minded perhaps than historically, I think that people might find this interesting. So I'm going to read a couple of excerpts from the book, not very long, so if you bear with me. So, for example, here, many eminent men have asserted that the Negro belongs to a distinct species. That is to say, that he is as widely separated from our own race as the wolf is separate from the dog or the zebra from the horse. They support their theory with the following arguments. That the Negro type presents physical and mental characters which are more conditions of climate, that the Negro type presents physical and mental characters which mere conditions of climate, circumstance, and food are incapable of creating, that the type is known to have existed in the earliest period of history, and that when transplanted to another soil, exposed to another climate, nourished with another food, it still retains its individuality. Then he goes on to kind of talk about the typical, outside characteristics. The skin is very black. The skin is very thick. The hair is snappy. The forehead is low and compressed. The nose is flat. The lips thick and brutal. That's from the book. I'm just quoting from the book here. The mouth projecting presents the appearance of a muzzle. That's, again, I'm quoting here. As, quote, as in the lower animals, the brain retreats to the back of the head and the organ of gluttony becomes the character of the face. So that's the mouth, I guess. The muzzle, so-called. So they kind of go on to talk a little bit.
In technical terms, that's protagonism.
Protagonism, yes. That's the word, yeah. I couldn't quite remember the word, thank you. And they kind of talk a little bit more about that. And then, so another point he makes. So their historical antiquity, however, does much toward explaining the persistence of the type transplanted. During at least 3,000 years, the Negroes have been influenced by certain climatic conditions, the results of which have been defined and strengthened by hereditary transmission, which is a very interesting note from a book written in the 1800s. Is this reasonable then to expect a complete reversion in 300? We would have, so this is talking about kind of bettering the race, I guess. The answer is no. It takes a lot longer than that, and the current climate of the world economy is the incentives are misaligned for that. They kind of talk about he makes the he kind of in the book he kind of makes the distinction between the true Negroes and the African Aboriginals, which I'm not quite sure whether he means like the Bantu versus the San kind of difference that we discussed in a previous episode, but I think that might be that. I'll need to kind of get into the book a little bit more for that. I just kind of skimmed through it for kind of more interesting more interesting examples of the kind of anthropological descriptions that this guy gives. So he talks about in Senegal. He talks about the coming kind of together of the Moors and the Negroes, and how they are how the two very distinct races, obviously. And then he goes on to talk a little bit about other tribes, which I think is it's kind of superfluous. It'll take far too long to kind of go through all of them, So very interestingly, the kind of the explanation he gives for the, quote, degeneration of the Negro as compared to the other races is the fact that they live in malarious regions. And he quotes from another fellow, "It is observed," writes Joseph Brown, "that the natives of marshy districts who permanently reside in them lose their whole bodily and mental constitution, contaminated by the poison they inhale. Their aspect is sallow and prematurely senile, so that the children often wrinkled, the muscles flaccid, the hair lank and frequently pale, the abdomen tumid and the stature stunted, and the intellectual and moral character low and degraded." And he gives examples from Egypt, Georgia, Virginia, and all across the world, basically, that the kind of the parasitic burden is an issue. And I think there is a little bit of truth to that. Obviously, it's far more complicated than that, but it's interesting that they kind of tend to blame malaria on the condition of the Western Africans.
And blame. Sorry, I just want to jump in here quickly. Yeah. Blaming malaria in particular is kind of appropriate for what is in essence, a Deus ex machina. Malaria, it literally is just bad air. That's what it means. Mal air. It's all it means is bad air. They literally thought that the air that you breathed in was bad. It took until after germ theory was entrenched for the mosquito-borne part of it to be understood. So, like, when they say it's malaria, like it's the name is very appropriate for what they believe. It's just that there's just something in the air that makes these people a little bit worse.
Yeah, that's another interesting excerpt here. In Africa, the Negro propagates children with difficulty. In America, as is well known, he's extremely prolific. In Africa, the Negroes are short-lived, but in the West Indies and in the States, statistics have proven that he attains to considerable longevity. We therefore have fair grounds for believing that, though nature has protected the Negro as much as possible by giving him a thick skull to protect his bare head from the rays of the sun, and copious secretions to refresh his skin and to reproduce that organic matter which is so quickly consumed, yet his native land is the one which is most fatal to him, or rather, indeed, that it is not the native land of the forefathers and his race. That's an interesting.
What year is that? What year?
This is is it the 1880s or something that he wrote? I don't want to lie. If you can, if you Google William Winwood Reed, William Reed, the book will be there.
Okay, because I'm just wondering, William Woodward Reed?
William Reed, yes. Winwood.
Oh, Winwood. Sorry, just...
Yeah.
1838. Okay, so he's writing this around about... Just as a stab in the dark, because he was born 1838, died 1875, and bloody hell, Now, Charles Darwin wrote Origin of Species not too soon before he was born, so like it was around there, so it wouldn't have been a hugely popular thing when he was writing this. So I'm just wondering, because what he's kind of writing is almost getting to natural selection.
Yeah, but it's very interesting.
It's like gets 90% of the way there, 90% of the way there, and then cucks.
Yeah, in a way, yeah. It's very interesting, and there's a little bit more that I think I should quote. So then he talks about what are the grounds for alleging that the Negroes do not belong to our species, that they are as widely separated from us as the dog from the wolf, etc. When two races are so far from each other that their progeny are sterile, they are said to be of a different species. This is the generally received definition of the term. Thus, the dog is said to be a different species from the horse, and the horse from the wolf. But the progeny of white men and Negroes, so far from being sterile, are prolific. The Cape de Verde Islands, with those of San Tome and Principe, are inhabited chiefly by a mulatto race. In the same manner, I have met with in Guinea the descendants of the Portuguese who settled there centuries before. They call themselves Portuguese and speak with contempt of the Negroes, from which they can seldom be distinguished. So that's the tragic mulatto right there. The term species is therefore quite inapplicable to the Negro, and from the changes that have already taken place in their conformation, it remains doubtful whether they can be classed on one side as a permanent variety. It is certain that the woolly hair, the prognathous development, and the deep black skin of the typical Negro are not peculiar to the African continent. The debasement of the Negroes is, on the whole, more physical than mental. I fancy that a great deal of nonsense has been written about the vigorous health of the savage, the purity of his diet, etc. That's right. To the Negro, certainly none of this is applicable. The Negroes suffer from intermittent and bilious fevers, which appear in the same forms with them as with us. So that's malaria, basically. He's talking about that. They are attacked by dysentery if they live entirely on fish. An exclusive vegetable diet afflicts them with cutaneous diseases. In the interior of Senegambia, they are subject to a disease from the want of salt, which curiously enough presents with all the characters of scurvy. In many parts of Africa, there is a horrible disease called the yaws, from which, on somewhat shallow evidence, the Lues venera is said to have originated. Through northern Guinea, the smallpox is prevalent, after which the face is pitted with blue marks, and against the disease they use inoculation. Pulmonary complaints carry off large numbers. Indeed, I do not know of a single disease to which Europeans are subject in the tropics which does not attack the Negro also, and with much greater virulence. The native doctors do a thriving trade, and I have frequently seen in the villages of equatorial Africa large quantities of medicinal bark being dried in the sun. Before I enter on the question of the mental characters of the Negroes, of the language, of their religious, political, and social institutions, it would be proper for me to consider the physical varieties and certain exceptional races which are found among them. So that's interesting. Dr. Pritchard and his disciples are inclined to draw important conclusions from the fact of a xanthous or blonde variety occurring in individuals among the Negroes. However that may be, I have frequently seen Negroes with red hair and black skins, though I have never seen an albino with black hair. It is also very common to meet with Negroes whose eyes are not black, but of a peculiar shade between a hazel and a green. Like the grey eye with us, it is frequently the indication of a cunning temperament. I think that's probably an indication of the mixing with the sort of North African, the Moors and the Berbers and all that. That's an interesting.
Yeah, especially the eye color.
Yeah.
Part. If I could just talk a bit about disease for a moment, because it's come up a bit. It's so what you might have gotten the impression of those who've been listening to Kathy reading from this text is kind of like there's almost like there is so much disease around Africa, and it's all like everything's utterly terrible, and kind of the fact of the matter is that that's not really true. The main problem with the disease burden in Africa is that they're only just starting to, or at least, when we started going over there, they were only just starting to agriculturalize, so that they were only just starting to come together in larger units, and so it makes that's fantastic for disease, and what that means is kind of like they haven't had enough evolution closely packed together to sort of start that selection for that particular type of disease resistance that we've got in Europe. And so then when it talks about why disease in Europe was so, when these Africans encounter, why it's so much worse for them, that makes a lot of sense when you think about it, because these parasites have had, be they bacteria, bacterial, viral, multicellular, like whatever they are, like if they're protists or, whatever they are, they've had longer to sort of, because don't forget that disease doesn't act, or disease-causing agents, microbes, it don't just sort of attack a group and then they go somewhere else. They're always there, and they're always around. And it's kind of like a balance of sickness and health that we sort of find with them. And occasionally they'll pop up a bit and then they'll drop down. It's a cyclical sort of thing. And we've adjusted to that, and we've started to fight off, our bodies have started to evolve ways to sort of deal with that. And then they've evolved ways to deal with how we deal with that, and, builds and builds and keeps going. And then this poor African guy comes in and is completely unadjusted to all that. He doesn't have that 10,000 years of living in a fairly close-knit community. And so, of course, that sort of disease is going to hit him hard. It's not that their constitution is weaker per se, or that there is, because it kind of seems weird that both of these kind of come out, like their constitution is weaker and there is more disease in Africa, is kind of the implication that you get from that. But it's kind of, it's not quite true. It's just they haven't actually had the time to evolve that sort of constant fight of resistance, and that we've had so much time to evolve towards. I just sort of wanted to put that there.
That's an interesting point, and also I think he kind of I think it's wrong to say that the Negro fares worse in Africa than the European, which I think is a little bit of what he stated, which is completely not true. Obviously, I mean, the only places that a Caucasian or anyone that's not a West African can live is sort of this South Africa and North super Saharan Africa, and other than that, you just eventually die by some sort of parasite or another, as happened to countless explorers.
The problem isn't so much like us going there and then encountering these brand new diseases, which there are. Like the reason why they're having such a terrible time of it, relatively, I guess, like we have an easier time in Africa than they have in Europe, is essentially what they're saying. And the reason why is because also in Africa, they're undergoing the Africans were undergoing fundamental changes in how their society worked. They were starting to they'd started to progress through the Neolithic Revolution, the development of basic agriculture, and then when they start to properly settle down, instead of just being tribal groups that settle down, either migrate continuously or settle down in particular regions depending on the season, they started to move from there to permanent settlements. And in fact, there were, like you described before, actually some of those permanent settlements. They hadn't been there for long, but they were there, and and the thing is, now they're having to deal with that extra evolutionary pressure in that manner, and that they've only just had that opportunity to encounter it.
Yeah, that makes sense. Absolutely. I think that the last thing I kind of want to quote from the book, if you bear with me, is he considers the social position of the Negress. So I think people might find this interesting as well. So the women among the Negroes are, as in the brute creation, are on the whole less handsome than the men. It has been noticed by Negroes even how ugly the Karoo women are, while the husbands resemble Roman gladiators. The hair of the true negress is but a little longer than that of the man. She will, however, spend hours in dressing it. I mean, that hasn't changed. Ridging it up like a helmet over a frisette, and lubricating with palm oil or forming it into all kinds of fanciful patterns. One favourite mode being to let it hang down in plaits no thicker than the whipcord. The bust is in early youth round and hard as black marble, but it has a tendency to elongate and present a conical appearance. To prevent this unsightliness, they deform it still more. A band is passed across the breast, which hang down like bags and in old age shrivel up almost completely. So the position of the women in Africa varies according to the civilization of their masters. They are always a step lower in the scale. It will easily be understood then that the study of a typical negress cannot be an elevating one. More hideous, more nearly approaching the brute than himself, she is nothing better than a beast of burden. The Negro of the lowest class always presents a little modesty, but while the men retire to wash themselves secretly, the women will frequently bathe in public and before strangers without the slightest shame. The negress, according to some authors, is excessively lascivious, and the lesbian vice is said to be so common as to produce the elongatio nympharum. I'll leave that to you guys to look up and to render excision necessary. So in many parts of Africa, no marriage can be ratified till a jury of matrons have pronounced a verdict of purity on the bride and of capability of the husband. In other parts, especially in the malarious localities where women are so frequently sterile, no one cares to marry a girl till she has produced a child. This has given rise to a supposition that they prefer a wife who has earned a little experience in dissipation. The real reason is that if they marry, they must pay a high price for their wife. This price they hope to regain by the sale of the children which she will bear. The Negroes, like animals, place no check upon their passions, but they have no idea of the so-called refinements of vice. And so on and so forth. Basically, it's no secret that women are, in a way, people consider Africa especially West Africa, to be more of a matriarchal society in the sense that women do all the work, but that doesn't give them, a big boost in the status. Indeed, they are the kind of the workhorses of their societies, really, and the sort of licentiousness and lack of moral inhibition when it comes to sexual matters is obviously well documented. So,
look up on that topic. Look up. What would get you an article regarding it? Hyena sex trade Africa, and the hyenas are men who are paid by the families to basically break girls who have just had their first period into womanhood, with all the detail that implies. It's it's messed up, but like that's their sort of attitude. Like you said, like buildings, like women need I don't want to go into much detail about it. Do look it up on your own. But yeah, it's just kind of it fits in with what you were saying before. Like women need to sort of have this guidance into womanhood, I guess you could say, and they hire men to do it in the obvious way, which is fucked up.
Yeah. Interestingly, just one last thing. Apparently, in the Congo, a princess of the Congo can marry any man she pleases. This man is obliged to adopt the name and garments of a woman. When he goes out, he is veiled, and a gong is beaten to warn all people to turn aside. It is frequently said that one may estimate the civilization of a country by the position of its women. According to this maxim, Congo is the most polished country in the world, for in none that I have ever heard of has the privilege of sex been so completely reversed. So, I mean, there are obviously various idiosyncrasies and exceptions, but I think overall you can say that the position of women in Africa obviously is in a lot worse place than it is in other parts of the world, really. The other thing I think we do need to discuss about a little bit is this, the African slave trade, and in this I mean slave trade in Africa, which is still hot and heavy and happening daily. So this is from another book, In 6 Years of a Traveler's Life in Western Africa, written in 1861 by Francisco Travassos Valdez. So he gives a first account of human sacrifice in the vast and powerful district of Bihe, just south of the Kingdom of Congo in Angola. So this might be interesting. When any one of these chiefs of all the different tribes there dies, the news of his death is not made known for 1 or 2 months afterwards. And if any person who has learned of the fact of his death discloses the secret, he is immediately decapitated and his family and relatives are sold into captivity. If there can be no purchasers of them, they are all decapitated by the common executioner. I mean, slavery in Africa, it's basically the captured in war, criminals, debtors, dowry, and the luckier relatives of a gossip, basically. The chief who is... carrying on for the quote. The chief who is appointed to the supreme command convenes a meeting of his subordinate chiefs. On this occasion, a bullock is sacrificed by the witch doctor, and also a white sheep and a white or fawn-colored pigeon, together with various other victims. But the principal sacrifice of this is that of one slave from each of the nations under the dominion of the paramount chief, the heads of whom are carried in triumph and exhibited to the populace, accompanied by drums and other instruments. The bodies are added to those of the other animals, and all are cooked together and distributed as a savoury dish to the chief and the other nobles. As soon as the proclamation is made, the new chief appoints a hunting party. When the chase is concluded, they return in triumph to the capital. On this occasion, a great excess is indulged in, many of the inhabitants being plundered and some even put to death, the law in the meantime taking no cognizance of the perpetration of such deeds. So, the sacrifice of the slaves is to give a dead chief's soul some company, and it's pretty kind of just ongoing, really. The main object contemplated in this national anniversary. This is from a book, Discovery and Adventure in Africa, written in 1844, describe how in 1772 an Englishman, Norris, travelled to the kingdom of Dahomey in present-day Benin. I mentioned it in the previous reading of Reed's book. So this is northwest of Congo in Africa. The main object contemplated in this national anniversary is that the king may water the grave of his ancestors with the blood of human victims. These are numerous, consisting of prisoners taken in war or condemned criminals, and of many seized by lawless violence. So, anytime the king has a message to convey to one of his deceased relations, he delivers it to one of his subjects, then strikes off his head, so that he may carry it to another world. Or if anything further occurs to him after which he has performed the ceremony, he delivers it to another messenger, whom he dispatches in the same manner. The customs or human sacrifices are practiced on a scale still more tremendous than at Dahomey. This is from a place in Ghana, in the Ashanti Kingdom. The Great Ashanti Kingdom, according to Wikipedia. The king had latterly sacrificed on the grave of his mother 3,000 victims, and at the death of the late sovereign, the sacrifice was continued weekly for 3 months, consisting each time of 200 slaves. On the occasion, the caboceers, so the people responsible for procuring slaves and princes in order to court royal favour, often rush out, seize the first person they meet, and drag him in for a sacrifice. The practice of offering human sacrifices to appease evil spirits is common, but in no place more frequent or on a larger scale than in the kingdoms of Ashanti and Dahomey and in the Bonny River. So this is present-day Nigeria. Large numbers of victims, chiefly prisoners of war, are statedly sacrificed to the manes, the spirits of the dead, of the royal ancestors in both of the first mentioned places, and under circumstances of shocking and almost unparalleled cruelty. At the time of the death of a king, a large number of his principal wives and favourite slaves are put to death, to be his companions and attendants in another world. And so on and so forth. So it's not very nice being a slave in Africa, and it has never been. And I think they the ones who got taken into America should count their blessings that they were not sacrificed to accompany a king or to carry his message into the afterlife.
Or, in the Barbary slave trade where they were either neutered or, continually raped.
Yeah, that's also that bit. So that's kind of the bulk of the overview, I think, of West Africa. Now, the interesting tribe that I think we probably have mentioned in the past is the Igbo tribe in Africa, who allegedly have like IQs as high as Europeans, and they have been known to be quite entrepreneurial and successful, and they basically run Nigeria as such, and they also run various mafias in England and America and and so on and so forth. So the question is, how did the Igbo become so entrepreneurial? It's possible that their location in the Niger Delta predisposed them to be the go-betweens in trade between coastal and interior peoples. Archaeological sites in the Niger Delta show that advanced economic development began much earlier there than elsewhere in West Africa. And this is seen in the early use of metallurgy. At one metallurgical complex dated to 765 BC, iron ore was smelted in furnaces measuring a meter wide. The molten slag was drained through conduits to pits where it formed blocks weighing up to 50 kilos. The operating temperatures were estimated to have been between 1,100 degrees and 1,500 degrees. So this production seems to have been in excess of local needs and therefore driven by trade with other peoples. So there's also a lot of bronze artifacts and other kinds of aspects of the trade, and they really were kind of the main traders when with Europeans as well. When sort of in the beginning in the 16th century, the Igbo were already the focus of a network of trading relationships that extended outward from the Niger Delta, and European traders kind of became integrated into this whole network. So this is an interesting part. They were also valued middlemen in the slave trade. So in the peoples of southeastern Nigeria have been involved in this trade for as long as there are any records. The archaeological sites of the Igbo Ukwu and other evidence reveal long-distance trade in metal and beads, as well as regional trade in salt, cloth, beads, and any sort of thus dates from then on and forward. The lower Niger River and its delta feature prominently in this early trade, and evidence is offered to suggest a continuity in the basic modes of trade of the lower Niger from the 700 or so BC to basically nowadays. The slave trade was a huge part of that as well. Something else I found while looking at West Africa was their claim to a script or a sort of a system of, so it's called Nsibidi, Nsibidi, a system of symbols indigenous to southern Nigeria, which is kind of a hieroglyphic looking script that it seems to have originated somewhere around 5th century AD or something like that, and it's quite kind of interesting looking. It's just sort of dashes and sort of curvy semicircles and that, but so it has been used. It was used sort of previous to European colonization, and it's kind of it's still used as a sense of we was kings and we was writers, I guess. So if people want to know more about that and what it looks like, you can always look that up. So yeah, that's about it. Do you guys have any comments?
Well, it's interesting the things you mentioned by people from the 17th and 18th, 19th century writing about Africans and writing how they have low levels of intelligence and things. There was someone who actually didn't think that, even though he had a lot of experience with Africans, and that's David Livingstone, the missionary, explorer, and doctor. And he thought that...
Livingstone, I presume.
Yes, exactly. He thought that their problem was bad economic system dominated by slavery and superstition, and he thought that they could be turned around by converting them to Christianity. But they weren't very interested in Christianity. They were more interested in, his guns and his medicine.
Well, to be fair, from his perspective, he hadn't seen the counterexamples of, what happens when they have a decent economy, etc., etc. So, I can kind of see that. You've got these savages just living in the middle of nowhere, and God has given you, not to disparage the religious, but, God has given you and your people this fantastic society. I can kind of see, the thought process there. We know now that it's wrong, but I can see and understand that.
Mm.
But anyway, were there any other thoughts before I wrap up today?
Well, I mean, I think as a final comment, a lot of people think that. I mean, it's not we was Kangs. It's not flying pyramids. It's not like, hardcore astronomy and traveling to space. But neither was it entirely just scrabbling around in the dirt and eating mud with no written languages or anything. I mean, definitely they lagged behind Europe, and their societies were not contemporaneously comparable to anything that was in Europe or China or any other more advanced civilization. But there were some civilizations there were some written languages, there were things like metallurgy, so they did have some things going on there.
Yeah, well, I don't think we've never said, on this show at least, we've never said that that was the case. I know I know you weren't saying that we did, but I'm just like it's. I think it's when people have an opinion, they tend to go towards the extreme of it, and that doesn't necessarily mean it's right. So it's like, oh, these people are less intelligent than us, therefore they have to be, basically in the dirt. No, they had, they had population groups that were coming together. They were only in the beginnings of that sort of development. If they had, a few thousand years more, the exact number, obviously we don't know because it's not going to be directly analogous to Europeans, but, it's quite possibly they would have developed a functional society. The problem is that didn't happen. We kind of got there first.
And all the trouble stemming from there. And I think another kind of important thing to bear in mind is obviously that, we make the mistake of, I think, sort of a parsimonious mistake of like thinking of Africa as, kind of a homogenous place, but it really isn't. And it has various different traditions and different cultures and things like that. And just because the average IQ in Africa is 70, that's the average. So that means there are people who are more intelligent than that, and there are groups that are more intelligent than that, and they have developed more or less functional, more or less advanced civilizations. And I think honestly, like
advanced is a bit of a heavy word.
Well,
there,
yes, that's the bit of blue, but compared to other parts of Africa, you would call for example, the Nigerian civilizations advanced if you compare them to the Bushmen,
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, and things like that. So it's a spectrum again, and it's important to bear that in mind. But I think because of the whole "we was Kangs" meme that the American blacks tend to push more than anyone, I think that there's a bit of a we tend to kind of maybe go a little bit the other way, and that's something to
you have a desire to shut it down.
Yeah. That's
Oh, and it's kind of fair enough. It's very whilst it is amusing, it is a bit sort of like disconcerting that they can actually believe that sort of thing. Like it's always funny, like that video of the the black Jew making the Jewish guy cry, the Ashkenazi guy cry. That is like, that's beautiful. That's beautiful watching. That's really funny, but at the same time, you're just kind of like, how have we let things get to this point where these people actually believe something like this? It's just kind of like, what?
Yeah.
But yeah, it's genuinely impressive, but it's just, and yeah, it's not trying to. It did kind of sound a bit cucky towards the end when we were just talking there, like we need to remember that they're. No, it's just kind of we have to. We should recognize how far that they got, which by European standards wasn't very far at all, but they got somewhere. And don't forget, they wiped out tribes who got not as far as them. So, they get fifth or sixth prize in the. They get a participation award in the race of civilization.
Yes, I mean,
Like,
without sort of external meddling, I think every kind of culture reaches the potential that its people are more or less suited to, I think.
well, yeah, as long as they're not wiped out by something
Yeah.
else or
And the
by
problem-
themselves or somehow.
Absolutely. And the problem, with Africans is that they are plucked out of the sort of the cultural milieu that they are adapted to, and then placed into one that they are absolutely not suited to, and then they're given the whole the whole current year victimization narrative, and
Yeah.
that's the big issue. It's not the what civilizations, what cultures developed in Africa. That's the problem. It's what it's being thrust upon them that they're not capable of dealing with in a constructive manner, in the West. So that's the big issue, really.
Yeah, it's a shitty catch-22. Like, do you put them in civilized? Do you put them in our sort of civilized society and just sort of expect them to succeed, or do you put them in somewhere where their outcomes are just strictly worse off? But that's kind of where their civilization is at that point. Like, both of those seem like kind of barbaric, but there is really no better option unless, go back to what we mentioned before, unless you're talking about doing some sort of, mass Jim Crow style control for a few thousand years, and that's not really viable.
No, I don't think that's. I really don't think that's something that we should be doing. It's not. I'm not of the mind that we should try and quote unquote civilize the Africans. It's not. I think it's a waste of our resources. It's in a way it's not fair on them because it's not what they.
We have no obligation to.
Yeah.
And they don't want it, so let's go all libertarian and just set them free by themselves.
Yes,
like in Africa.
Yes, as long as end the hate, segregate. Is what I say when it comes to that.
Yeah, it's just it's a shitty position. We probably should have never engaged in the slave trade to begin with, but what are you going to do? It was kind of in fashion at the time. Everyone was doing it. Had to look cool.
Everyone in Africa is still doing it. So.
Everyone in Africa is still doing it. Yeah, well, they're old school.
Well,
Spears and shit.
the British Empire is unique in that it conquered people, and the people that were conquered had more freedom than they previously used to have, whereas usually conquest and slavery went together like bread and butter. So, I mean, I'll take the full rap for, my ancestors practicing slavery. I wouldn't deny it, but my ancestors also patrolled
ended it.
They also ended it, that's right. The Royal Navy patrolled the oceans looking for slave ships, and I can't think of any other contemporaneous civilization that did that.
Well, they actually still have that patrol going to this day. And that's the thing is, every civilization on the face of the earth practiced slavery in one form or the other. Only one of them got rid of it.
Yeah, that's right.
And they will never be forgiven for it.
And they'll never be forgiven for it. Like, I guess we should just kept the slaves.
Things then they wouldn't fucking complain about it, would they?
There is a man, Hilton Rowan Helper, and I don't know what the South thinks of him because he wasn't well liked during the Civil War, but he wrote about slavery. He's the author of Negroes in Negroland, which is probably one of the most entertaining book titles ever made. But he wrote that, and he wrote about he opposed slavery because of the economic burden it placed on Southern progress. Like he was against it because it actually was holding them back as far as development was concerned, industrial development, and their economic prowess was concerned. And he went through and used statistics and all that sort of stuff. And it's just kind of like, I guess that's sort of like the attitude that we need to have. Is it's like kind of shitty, but this is how it really screwed us over. But at the same time, he was an evil white supremacist who refused to patronize hotels or restaurants that employed blacks. So, it's like, this is things kind of shitty, but I still want to be white. Doesn't mean that I'm going to destroy my entire civilization just because we made a couple of crappy decisions in the past.
Yeah.
Anyway, this has been the Darwin Digest episode 46, where we have been discussing Northeast and West Africans. Next week, we will be discussing a few of the interesting Asiatics. I'll see you next week.